think let's start. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name is Keith Khan-Harris, and I'm pleased to... I'd like to say that progressive and orthodox denominations. But in the last few years, a new kind of division has emerged that threatens to be even more disturbing, disabling, and embittering than denominational division. That is, division over Israel. From being a source of overwhelming consensus in the Jewish world, at least in the post-1967 period, Jewish Israel degenerate into a series of bitter accusations and counter-accusations. For the past 3 years, I've been trying to develop a way of nurturing civility in Jewish communal disagreements over Israel as part of the project New Jewish Thought. I've been trying to create safe spaces for dialogue over Israel and to bring people together from different sides of the divide in order to think about ways a SETI dialogue in Israel. And this is where David Newman and Gerald Steinberg come in. Both Gerald and David are UK born, although Gerald has an American accent, but they're Israeli-based academics. Gerald is president of NGO Monitor and professor of political studies at Bar Ilan University. Is both about Israel in the diaspora and in the country itself. Both of them have sometimes been controversial figures. Both of them have very different but equally passionate opinions on the direction that Israel should take. In this evening's sessions, I want to pose 2 challenges to David and Gerald. The first challenge is to talk about how we talk about Israel in a debate where the moderator who's seen to be and is impartial. I'm very grateful then that Richard Pollins has stepped in to moderate the dialogue. Richard is a journalist, a producer on the BBC World Service programme World Have Your Say. Richard's role will be to pose some questions that will help focus the dialogue and to ensure that problem.
I think there's very little question that when we debate about Israel, whether it be amongst Jews or between Jews and non-Jews, we get very highly emotive. All political debates are emotive, but I think in terms of you become a Jew or you're a traitor, if you're a supporter of settlement, you're a fascist and a colonialist. And of course, once you get into that sort of language, it's very hard to steer the debate back into any middle ground, when at the end of the day, I think it would be fair to say that at least talking about Israeli Jewish public opinion, I think most people
do not make my political disagreements, my political perspectives and analyses personal. And I don't think that I have a personal, from my part of any kind of discussion or dialogue, I don't think that there's any evidence, and I certainly don't see. What I hear with a number of statements from the New Israel Fund, which I criticize entirely legitimately, and I think with the understanding now by many people in the New Israel Fund that they in fact did not have the information necessary to make the kind of decisions they were making. We can talk about that later on. We're moving towards, I think, significant agreement precisely through this dialogue. But the first response was vicious kind of mudslinging in a very personal nature. Ethics political on is this either-or dichotomy. And in many of your columns, David, in which you've attacked me, they have reflected a strong either-or dichotomy. That if you're not someone who opposes the settlements and occupation, then you must be a flaming right-winger. You don't use the term fascist. Other people do. I'm not sure quite, I don't remember how much more call issues. Keith, I can't imagine having a discussion with anybody who's in independent Jewish voices, from what I understand. They would not be members of my dinner party, because I don't understand what makes them Jewish from the ones that I know about. And from what I see, they are so anti-Israel and so anti-Zionist that I don't see people who...
The person who writes about borders, that's what I do in my professional life when I have time for it. But I think where you draw and define your borders is very important. I think the one that Gerald, and this sort of last statement that... by the way, I can't remember more than once where I've attacked you personally, Gerald. And,
I have a list of 3 here, okay. But that's okay.
but that's because you created an NGO monitor. Find the borders, debate within the Western democratic world. And I think defining the borders is very, very difficult. I also have my own borders for the left. I think someone who comes from a clear position of anti-Semitism and wants to delegitimize the very existence of the State of Israel just for the sake of legitimization, he or she is not a racist.
So, is there you wanted to come back on what I said earlier?
I want to expand the point, because what's the purpose of these kinds of conversations? Who's the audience? And I want to distinguish between two, and I'd like to hear from the gentleman, but maybe we'll have to wait till afterwards. I just picked that as a group because I know it was just in Keith's article, and it struck me as beyond my... But I don't think I'm going to convince David, and I don't think there's a chance in hell that David's going to convince me of anything. We've had a long relationship back and forth. We know each other's positions pretty strongly. And I think there's a mutual respect, but we know where those borders are. But when we debate here, we're trying to influence you. And let's be honest about that. When we go to an ambassador's residence to talk about Israeli-Palestinian issues, we're not, and we talk about these issues, it's not the conversation argument meeting, but I say, why should I bother? It's just going to raise my blood pressure and it's not going to change anything.
I'm going to jump in there quickly because that is a question about what this is about and stuff. Although I think you were probably being rhetorical in asking me this.
Slightly.
But I'm going to jump in about that because I think it is actually an important question. I think in terms of perhaps influence, if you're seeking to influence people, maybe influencing people about how you talk rather than necessarily what you talk about. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah. I mean, are you able to talk to Gerald without raising his blood pressure, do you think?
First of all, I didn't know he had a blood pressure problem.
I didn't until we started doing these things.
We always debate or dialogue just for the sake of convincing the people around the table. Gerald brought up a very good example. The two of us are often to be seen at various diplomatic gatherings in Israel, and there may be a dinner afterwards, and you're sitting around the table, and there may be a guest from either the EU or from Washington. We actually end up by convincing someone who comes with one position to go home or to go away holding another position.
I'm going to move it on. Is there responsibility for the problem, the way we address each other over Israel, largely on one side of the debate?
Certainly, I don't think so. I generally paint me. I won't go through my background and my history, and I am one of those people who changes his mind based on seeing different activities and different developments. But so I don't think that settlements or occupation are good for Israel. I also don't think that that pulling out of the settlements are cities of. I think that the occupation and responsibility for Palestinian lives and this entanglement we have with Palestinians does a lot of damage to Israel. That's a complex position, much more complex than I've said in the last 30 seconds. But people on the left and the right who have extremely hardcore ideological views find that unacceptable. So my short answer to you is no, I don't think one side or the other is responsible for that. When Jews and Israelis were being killed in bus bombings and other things, and he was appalled and ashamed by Israeli war crimes. And I said around the table, it was a relatively closed meeting, but we were talking to an audience of international diplomats, and I said, as far as I know, your only Jewish identity is that you attack Israel. And he's not the only one in that category. And we had a pretty difficult debate, and that was the end of it. He showed no...
So we all get
but
that.
Who was that? Was that a left or a right-wing attack?
No, there was someone to the right of you. Far to the right of you. I think from that point of view, we're in actually quite a similar position. There's no question that our basic positions, I would say, let's say we would agree that Jerry is centre right, and I'm centre left. You know about David painted to a certain extent, and background is something, by the way, people are very quick to bring up in order to sort of explain on
It makes it personal.
Number one, it makes it personal. Number one, people are always trying to explain on your behalf what your position is. And I don't know whether that's something specifically characteristic of Jewish forms of debate or of theology, to an other sense creates a certain glossary of terms and a certain form of dialogue which I find it very hard to break out of. I think the fact that probably we have a certain scenario, the fact that we've both, been on a certain journey in life and have sort of come from different places and have come from different contexts. If your identity part of being the chevra, and we do tend to raise a greater variety of views. Having said that, we reflect certain sides of what's going on in Israel. And we do approach the line which draws between being pragmatic and ideological. The minute you cross the line into being ideological, you, in a exclusive, do
in any way? Did it used to affect you if it doesn't affect you now?
Well, obviously, I think the fact that both of us sort of for every so often, every few weeks, take off our academic hats and decide to get involved in the public debate by writing op-eds, now the first lesson you have to learn from that is you don't get involved in Israel. There is, I could empirically quantify and say there is a difference between the right-wing responses I get from Toronto, Brooklyn, Northwest London to the right-wing responses I get, say, from someone living in the West Bank or Efrat. I can get people writing in from the first group and saying, you're a self-hating Jew, what are you doing in Israel? I've even had one who says, I hope you and your family get blown up in the next Palestinian people.
You have to have a thick skin to go into this, and you should be aware of that you're going into this with getting hit if you're taking on sacred cows. When I went into when I decided that it was an evolutionary process, I saw what I saw as a major, not just threat, but also exploitation of human rights language, and went into what became NGO. But that process also is far more vicious. It's the toxic voice kind of language, and the context was worse. And the language in most cases from Israel is strongly disagree with you, but there's a common fate, a common Zionist element in there, which limits the vitriol. This is not, I believe in this stuff, but but what I'm saying is, yes, it does have an effect, but it's an effect that has to be taken into account. I always wonder how thick skins. We are partial politically visible. I wouldn't even call us politicians because we're not involved in party politics. But I wonder what kind of skins people in politics have. I think about Tony Blair. I think about others who have been attacked extremely viciously and the political to attack someone you disagree with. Then there's a apology in there, and I think that many of the discussions as we've reached that stage, even in terms of the various kinds of discussions that I wouldn't call them even dialogues on Anglo Jewry and its position on Israel, and some of it's gotten to the Israeli press as well. We need to find a way to have these discussions.
80% of the people who write to you or write talkbacks will be the people who disagree with you. Far fewer people who agree with you will take the time to write back something positive. You don't necessarily have to think that the whole world is against you, that not everybody agrees with you. I mean, obviously there are, I'm very conscious of the fact, a sort of a public column at the end of the 90s, did it for about 5 years, and at that time, the Jerusalem Post, which I would define as being a right-of-centre newspaper, at that time was rather an extreme right-of-centre newspaper. I stood very much on people's toes at one time on one or two articles, and the then editor at the time, Brett Stevens, sort of kept a left-wing criticism of her and her activities. Is it by the NGO Monitor?
No, it was by Im Tirtzu, actually. You better get your facts right. And she threatened to sue the Jerusalem Post, and then they said, well, if you want to sue us, then you'll have to stop writing for us. Get the facts right.
She was the third fig leaf.
But true.
She was the third fig leaf, but now there are two of us.
Larry Durfner?
And Larry as well, you're right. But he's a staff reporter. He's not an outside writer. Just one final comment. And at one point, I was approached someone like me.
I think so, just one. Do you think of anything that you've behaved unfairly, you behaved inappropriately, maybe you did it in the heat of the moment, and you had regrets afterwards? If so, what were they and what did you do?
No, never.
You've never behaved inappropriately? There you go.
I think there's a difference. I think there's a difference between Jerry and my respect. Being an NGO monitor, Jerry is therefore a player in the game. The NGO monitor is a player in the political game. Now, I think that's a very major difference at the moment between where each of us...
Does that mean he's behaving?
No, I'm saying, so therefore, by being a player in the political game, you are therefore automatically casting your analysis.
Trying to figure out anybody who writes columns on a regular basis, who chairs meetings, who deals with European diplomats and tends to be a Europhile in an environment where that has a lot of connotations, is also part of the game. You're part of the game.
Yes,
You
I'm a Europhile, I admit it. And,
okay, but that means that you also hope that as they impact or they exploit human rights and other issues, but it's a very specific position because that's where it began. It began out of the Durban Conference, this very intensive attack against Israel. And I think that's also a legitimate process, and you're welcome to set up your own monitors to take on the issues that you think are important to do. I think it has created a grant of another $500,000 so we can have more than 4 researchers. It's extremely difficult to do, and one has to set priorities in all of these things, so I'd be happy to do that. We're tackling a very specific set of issues, but I think there are a broader set of issues, David, and you can be part of that. There are the specific role of European government promote lawmakers them as part of the power structure of how the world works. There's a tremendous amount of soft power in NGOs, and I think you will agree with me that we've made that into an issue in the last 10 years. So that it wasn't there before. But there's a new issue coming up, and that's the issue of foreign funding in general, right, left, for politicians, for all sorts of different activities in Israel. And I wonder how that, my sense is, to get, but what did, was they went out of Israel to raise money for their campaigns. And that's I use that as an example because it's the newest version. But a huge amount of Israeli politics is supported by foreign money across the board, on all sides. And I think that's something I've learned from this process, is that we need to look systematically. And I don't know how to do that on a day-to-day basis. It's something I've been thinking about. And
that's probably because they rhyme in English.
Literally squares.
They're literally square, and I think it's a major problem because, you're all very conscious of the fact that Israeli institutions, be they hospitals or universities or yeshivot, come competing for the very scarce pound or dollar in your pocket, and yet a lot of the politicians are raising larger funds behind the scenes from people who aren't getting that extreme language. There have been cases where I've attacked certain institutions. There have been very, very rare cases where I have gone for individuals or for people. I've obviously discussed politicians and prime ministers, but on the whole I go for causes rather than for people. I've gone for the NGO monitor.
Coming to solutions and how we talk about Israel, shouldn't be too much of an issue because neither of you have ever said anything inappropriate. Is there anything that you think personally you could do differently? You could help to, reach out to others who hold different opinions.
I understand there's generational rebellion and a little bit of ego building by some of the leaders, as happens in every generation. But I also see this gap in terms of substance. And I find it very frustrating. This willingness to join in the correct criticism of Israel is humility. Humility not in the personal sense. There's probably a better term than that. I always tell my students now, when I started teaching in Hebrew, I was largely unable, I was illiterate in one language. Now I'm illiterate in 2 languages. It's some of the words just aren't there anymore. But in terms of presenting and talking about Israel, participate in this Israel back, let me know that there's a purpose to it and there's a substance to it.
BBC from the Israel.
Okay.
I'm going to respond because I don't know if Jerry's totally conscious of what he just did. He basically, in the past, first we started with independent Jewish voices.
Let's not make it personal here.
First we started with independent Jewish voices, and now J Street is illegitimate.
No, I didn't. You did not.
Era of maybe many of the more establishment type of institutions. And rather than say, let's be inclusive and let's incorporate and let's understand that young Jews in the diaspora today, yes, they want to support Israel and they want to be part of Israel, but they're critical of Israel because Israel model 2010 for a 25-year-old is not Israel model 70. Some groups sentence them, rather than to include them. What's happened in the way we talk about Israel has been to say, that's beyond the pale. Let's delegitimize them. Let's close them out. And you only have to have read, the whole discussion that took place here in England a few weeks ago over the comments of the head of the UJIA, Mick Davis, backed by, I understand, most of the Jewish leadership. There are delegitimizers out there. But most of the groups mentioned here, whether they be Jewish groups or other groups, are critical of Israel because they do not agree with a lot of things going on in Israel today, but that does not take them beyond the pale. And I think this sort of form of anti-European and anti-British diatribe that as though the only concept from the 50s and the 60s. On the other hand, I think we would both argue there is a difference between where you're coming from. And that's true of the writers as well. It's not one side of the conflict. You can be critical from both sides. There is a difference between who the criticism is coming from, what sort of crowd.
You're more Catholic than the Pope. There must be a Jewish and Mishle equivalent of that. Because the leaders of the New Israel Fund have accepted a lot of our guidelines. Because what they were doing and what they were funding and the way they were acting was very misguided on about 20% of their budget. The question was never the New Israel Fund. That's other groups' agendas. And the image tax. Is he still the chair of the NIF UK? Anybody know? Yes. Okay, in August 2009, he sent a huge email attacking NGO Monitor with the headline, "It's time to nail the lies." Now, there were no lies. It was simply a disagreement, and that's actually something that I think they've learned to regret. The language that we hear from the New Israel Fund is no longer that makes it. I think we agree on this. We started with this point. We are both Israelis. We are both Zionists. You can criticize Zionism. You can criticize Israel. You can criticize policies. When it becomes, that's not ad hoc. I'm also missing a word here. When it becomes yeah. Okay, then I did not hear that, and I'm glad that that was done. I think that's extremely important. And I did not join in the attacks on Mick Davis on this, but I do think that there are legitimate questions about the language that's used and the framework, the political framework, so that it doesn't seem to be interpreted
there. Because this is how people are thinking about Israel today. Maybe they're not far off the point. Rather than say, you're not thinking like the government's telling you to think, therefore you shouldn't be saying anything. In other words, is this a question of where, because the political thinking isn't the correct one for this particular period of time, we're therefore trying to close down the debate?
Or is it part of... Not personal.
And I was actually in the room when the decision was made to refine or to make the definition concerning boycott divestment. And it wasn't necessarily because of anything that you had, it was simply a change in the landscape.
It's important. It took... There was a period of hammering on the door and attack and counterattack, and it was clear that this was going on for about 6 months. With Daniel Sokach, with Naomi Chazan, with Rachel Liel. It was going back and forth. And it was not only from NGO Monitor, but from quite much more political organizations. But there was a willingness to change.
Audience revolt here. Maybe can I clarify a couple of things, and then we can I'm sorry to tread on Richard's toes, but I think it's kind of necessary since it's for better or for worse. This session was my plan, and I think it's important to clarify why it was my decision, and it was agreed by the panelists. One of the things that, in my experience, often derails dialogue and makes dialogue difficult is that it often founders on when people mention a specific substantive issue, and the other person says, that is not factually correct. And then things can often spiral into a very particularly productive. Then at some point you're gonna hit on an issue where somebody's saying, no, you're wrong about that. Well, that's my experience, and experience is often that. Now I recognise I've sort of trod on Richard's toes a bit, but also that we've got 5 minutes left. So I wonder if Richard would like to create a closing question. I do appreciate that there is a sense that this is not...
So kind of, you entered the room an hour ago.
I won't claim to have any grand transformations. I will say something that I mentioned earlier and I think needs to be said more strongly. The Agadah from the Gemara that we recall on Tisha B'Av, speaking truth to power is what we do. And these are all institutions with a tremendous amount of power. At the same time, it is extremely important to remember to do it on a substantive and not a personal basis. To understand the boundaries of that disagreement process and know where you've those boundaries. Kind of sure whether this
landscape has changed. I think one of the big problems about talking about Israel today is the fact that many of the people doing the talking in terms of politicians, academics, maybe diplomats and so on, they're still using a sort of discourse and an argument and a contextualization which was probably relevant 20 years ago, but the change 10, 15, 20 years ago. And I think we have to create a different sort of discourse or a different sort of language which is relevant to those generations, because otherwise those generations are not going to be supportive of Israel, whether it be from the left or the right, in 20 years' time.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone else for coming. Keith, is there anything you wanted to, in terms of how you touched on the dialogue?
As I say, this is tough stuff. Let's keep talking. We're at the start of the process.